Hi Year 11s and 12s, welcome to the second video in our very first PowerPoint of Stage 2 Biology, looking at DNA structure. In this video we're going to be looking at RNA structure as well as what DNA looks like in eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells. Now in the last video we looked at DNA structure, and we also had on the second slide we had a need to know. Now that need to know will contain information for this video. There is no need to know for this video specifically. It's all included in that first video, so if you haven't got those down you will need to pause this video, go back to the last video and write those down. They are everything that will be tested on in the test and exam this year. For now though, let's continue looking at RNA structure. So RNA is another type of nucleic acid. Like DNA, it's a polymer. And like DNA, it's made up of the monomers, nucleotides, which are just repeating units. There are a few key differences between DNA and RNA, most of which can be seen either in this diagram or in the name, DNA and RNA. The very first, obviously, which is quite noticeable here, is that DNA is a double-stranded molecule, whereas RNA, as you can see, is only single-stranded. So it's only one strand. The next big change here is in the name. We've got DNA and RNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, and ribonucleic acid. That means that DNA actually has deoxyribose, whereas RNA has just ribose. Like we discussed in the last video, they have different bases. So while they both have adenine, guanine, and cytosine, RNA has uracil found instead of thymine. Okay, so DNA has thymine, RNA has uracil. What you can't see in this picture very much is that RNA strands are also generally shorter than DNA strands. That's all we need to know on the structure of DNA, so let's move on to looking at what DNA looks like in a eukaryotic cell. Now, if you remember back from year 9, 8, and 10 science, a eukaryotic cell is a cell that has organelles and is found in a multicellular organism. Okay, now in that process, DNA, which we've got here, is packaged into linear chromosomes, which means they're straight lines, and that only happens in eukaryotic cells. Now, I know this diagram here doesn't really look like a linear shape. What you've got to remember here is when you say chromosome, they think of this very specific shape. Now, we draw it like this because this is the first image we ever saw of a chromosome. And we can only really see them when they're like this because they're getting ready for replication. For cell division, in which case the genetic information has been replicated, it's been doubled. So generally, when we can't see DNA, it looks like just one of these strands. When we can't see chromosomes, sorry, it just looks like one of these strands. When it gets ready for cell division, it replicates and becomes this shape. So generally, chromosomes just look like this one little line here, which you can see as a line is quite linear. Now these chromosomes are made up of something called chromatin. All that chromatin is, if you're ever asked, is just a mixture of DNA and proteins. Now for a eukaryotic cell, that DNA is wrapped around a globular protein, which means it's round and blob-like. So DNA is wrapped around a globular protein called a histone. Okay, and when the DNA wraps around those histones and coils up, we get chromatin. Okay. Now, in eukaryotic cells, most of the time, the DNA is found inside the nucleus, and you will never find less than 2 chromosomes in that nucleus. You'll always have more than one chromosome in the nucleus. That's just what eukaryotic cells have to have. But you can also, in eukaryotic cells, find DNA in the mitochondria and the chloroplasts. Now, what's unusual about this is while this DNA is not used for genetic information for our bodies, the DNA in mitochondria and chloroplasts is very, very similar to the DNA that's found in prokaryotic cells. So, that means, when we're looking at DNA in prokaryotics, remember a prokaryotic cell is a single-celled organism, the DNA is circular. And because prokaryotic cells don't have organelles, we find that in the region called the nucleoid. Okay, so this region here is called the nucleoid. I know the diagram doesn't really look circular, but trust me, the DNA is circular. Okay, Prokaryotic cells don't contain histones, but they do contain other types of proteins which will help in those organizations of the chromosomes in the nucleoid. Prokaryotic cells also have an extra part of DNA, some prokaryotes, called plasmid DNA. For now, all you need to know is the name plasmid DNA, and we'll talk about that more when we get to genetic engineering later on in DNA and proteins.